Welcome to Forgotten Contract. It was the day of her 16th birthday that the letter arrived. The letter that would redefine her life from that day onward. Susan Bones was an athletically built busty redhead with piercing blue eyes and an easy smile. She was about average height, though if you asked her, she'd tell you she was short. Her skin was the color of rich cream, though she didn't have the freckles typical of most redheads. Save for a few on her petite nose. She was only a few days removed from the end of her 5th year at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, and quite happy to be home. It had been her most difficult year so far, owing to the fact that it had been her OWL year, and on top of that, she and the rest of the school had been stuck with a defense teacher who had refused to teach them any spells at all. If it hadn't been for the secret defense club, Susan and many others would have outright failed the subject. Hardest of all had been working all year to let the boy of her dreams know that she was interested in him. Zachariah Smith had become much better looking over the year, but on top of that, he'd become less obnoxious. She'd spent all year flirting, and giving signs that she wanted to date him, only to suffer the heartache of seeing him start dating someone else. But the year hadn't been all bad. A couple of the highlights revolved around that absolutely amazing game of Truth or Dare near the Easter holiday. She had gotten to kiss Zach. Really kiss him. Sure, it had been on a dare from Hannah, but her best friend was just trying to help the two get together. Okay, sure, she'd had to endure Ernie groping her chest, and she'd had to let Thomas Summers spank her bottom. But Hannah grabbed her boobs all the time in the dorm, and Sally Ann constantly slapped all the girls on their bottoms. It really hadn't been all that different. Okay, Ernie wasn't as gentle as Hannah. Which was saying something, as Hannah always just grabbed a handful when she could. Susan and Hannah had agreed on the train ride home that it had been a rather sexually charged year in Hufflepuff House. At least with the 5th, 6th, and 7th years, anyway. Both also agreed they were anxious to see how things developed over the next 2 years. Susan was remembering what it was like to kiss Zach as she lay out in the warm morning sunshine, lounging in her favorite pale blue bikini. She'd been banished from the house for the day while her Aunt Amelia prepared for the party that evening. Her aunt was the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and given what had happened in the ministry just a few weeks ago, Susan was shocked and eternally grateful that her aunt was putting her first. Amelia Bones was a very strong, capable witch, and with the terrorist known to the world as He Who Must Not Be Named, or Lord Voldemort, if you were extremely brave, back to wage war on society. Susan couldn't help but feel simultaneously joyful, and scared. But Auntie Amelia would hear none of it. You're going to be 16, and that's something very special. The world can manage without my assistance for one day, she had said over breakfast, right before she had banished her niece out of the house. Susan was really looking forward to her birthday party. Hannah would be arriving in just a few hours, and would be staying for a few weeks before both girls went to Hannah's house. Some of her Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw friends were coming, and Neville Longbottom, who Hannah had begun to fancy. Susan didn't see it, but Hannah swore there was a Neville that girls were going to be lining up to be with very soon, and she wanted to be first in line. Zach was going to be there, though he said he was bringing his girlfriend. Susan wasn't too happy about this. It wasn't that she hated the girl, only the fact that she had turned Zach's head. Although, when she thought about it, which she hated to do, Zach was likely better matched to his girlfriend than she would have been. It didn't help, but Susan never liked lying to herself. Susan was replaying the night when Hannah had dared Zach to really snog her socks off. When the large tawny owl landed on the table beside her lounge chair, spilling her iced tea all over the place. "Oh, for the love of Morgana," Susan muttered. The owl simply held out its legs so she could remove the letter. As soon as it was relieved of its burden, the owl took flight once again. Susan shook her head in annoyance as she broke the seal on the official-looking letter. She had to read it 3 times to make sure she was reading it all correctly. After the third read, she could feel all the warmth in her body drain away as the cold grip of terror tightened around heart. "It's a joke," she whispered. "It's a really bad joke. No one does this anymore. This can't be real." She flipped the letter over, trying to find where it said haha, but there was nothing, only the Gringotts seal. Susan quickly got to her feet and padded into the house, where she found her aunt sitting in the dining room going over some paperwork. Amelia looked up at the sound of bare feet slapping hard against the tile floor. "Susan, one thought I told you. Look at this," Susan said, slapping the letter on the table in front of her aunt. "It's a joke, right? Someone's trying to pull a prank on me." Amelia picked up the letter, looking at her niece's expression of horror, and read the letter thoroughly. Before she too flipped it over, looking for the postscript identifying it as a practical joke. Amelia even took out her wand and did a few revealing spells on it. "So, it's a prank, right?" Susan asked, fear evident in her voice. Her arms were wrapped around herself, trying to ward off a non-existent chill. "When did this arrive?" Amelia asked with concern. "Just a moment or 2 ago. I read it before I brought it to you," Susan said, hoping her aunt would tell her everything was all right. The grim look on Amelia's face did nothing but make Susan even more frightened. Amelia got up from her chair and grabbed a light traveling cloak. "I will be back as soon as I can. You are to remain here, but you are not allowed in the kitchen. Amy will bring you lunch. I expect Hannah will be over shortly. You two can stay outside, or in your room. Do not mention this letter to anyone, including Hannah, until I return. Am I understood?" "Yes, Auntie." "But can you tell me what's going on?" Susan asked hopefully. "That's what I'm going to find out," Amelia said, stepping into the fireplace. In a flash of green flame, Amelia Bones vanished, leaving a very disturbed Susan behind. Susan wasn't on her own for very long. Nearly 10 minutes had passed when the fire blazed and Hannah Abbott fell out, swearing. "You're lucky my aunt isn't here," Susan said, smiling at her best friend as the blonde stood up. Brushing herself off. Hannah Abbott was taller than her red-headed best friend by 2 inches, with light blonde hair that fell to the middle of her back when she didn't put it up. She had bright blue eyes and a petite button nose. She was thinner than Susan and less buxom as well. "Well, can you blame me? I hate the flu. I can't wait until I can apparate," Hannah groaned. She lifted her bag off the floor and grinned at her best friend. "So, I have 2 birthday presents for you." Hannah had started for Susan's bedroom with the redhead trailing behind her. "One you have to wait for until your party, but the other one you can have now, because I think you should wear it tonight. I think it might help you with Zach." The 2 girls entered Susan's room and Hannah set her bag on the bed she normally used when she stayed over. She began rummaging through her bag and pulled out her swimsuit, followed by a small flat box which she handed to Susan. Susan smiled curiously as she opened the box. Not sure if she liked Hannah's lurid smile. What lay inside the box could only be described as scandalous. It was by far sexier than anything she owned, or had seen in real life. "You have to try them on right now," Hannah said, practically bouncing on the balls of her feet. Her hands clasped in front of her face as she looked ready to burst with glee. "Where in the world did you get this?" Susan asked, lightly running her fingers across the silken material. "My sister took me to a place called Victoria's Secret. It was amazing. You should see what I got for myself. I mean, we all talked last year about stuff like this. My sister helped pick it out. She's amazing with this stuff. She says we'll figure it all out on our own eventually, but she gave me a few good tips." Like, they should always match. Guys think it's sexier that way. She also said to invest in a few pairs of high heels, which I did. Now will you try it on? I want to see how you look. Susan stripped out of her swimsuit and slipped the deep red panties up her legs, loving how it conformed to her body. And also seemed to enhance it. The high-cut panties made her cream-colored legs look longer somehow. And the matching bra lifted her chest and gave her the best cleavage she'd ever had since her breasts had first appeared. I knew it. Hannah shouted gleefully. I just knew it. Perfect color, perfect cut. If I were a guy, I'd be all over you. Heck, I'm thinking about mauling you anyway. Oh, you know just what to say to make me all hot. Susan smirked, rolling her eyes. But I do feel really sexy in these. The redhead went to the full-length mirror and checked herself out. She was quite impressed with how she looked in the bra and panty set. I know, right? Hannah grinned. Check this out. Hannah dropped her shorts and spun to reveal she was wearing an electric blue thong. Susan's mouth fell open. Hannah then tore off her shirt to reveal the matching bra. Once I put this on, and I went out with my sister, I couldn't help notice all the boys looking at me. It's like wearing these things makes you more confident, and boys just sense it or something. Hannah began to undress and put on her bikini. Susan changed back into her own swimsuit and the two girls went outside to soak up the sunshine, and talk about boys. After a light lunch, the girls swam in the pool and continued to tan themselves. With Hannah there with her, Susan had very nearly forgotten all about the foreboding letter she'd received that morning. Amelia Bones had never been so infuriated in her life. If this letter turned out to be a joke on her niece, she would nail the culprit right to the wall. She stormed through Diagon Alley all the way up the marble steps of Gringotts Bank and up to the first available clerk. I wish to speak with Bloodnail, she demanded. The goblin barely looked up from his ledger as he replied. Do you have an appointment? He asked, a soft growl in his voice. No, but this is a bit of an urgent matter. I'm Amelia Bones, and I need to speak to my account manager this minute. If you do not have an appointment, I cannot. Listen to me. I wish to speak with Bloodnail. You get him out here this minute, or so help me. Madam Bones. Amelia turned and found the very goblin she wished to see standing behind her. He looked more than a little irritated, but she didn't care. I wish to find out the meaning of this, Amelia said, thrusting the letter out to the goblin, who took it with an arched eyebrow. Bloodnail read the letter before motioning to Amelia that she should follow him. They walked down a long hallway and up 3 flights of stairs before they came to the goblin's office, where he told her to sit. Once Bloodnail was in his own seat, he set the letter upon his desk and folded his long finger together. This letter seems to be pretty straightforward. I do not understand your confusion. Her parents didn't do this, and as I've been her guardian since she was barely a year old, I didn't set it up. I want to know where it came from and if there's a way to break it, Amelia demanded. Bloodnail sighed heavily, but opened the drawer to his right and slipped out a magical ledger. He plucked the quill from the ink bottle and scratched something upon the first page. There was a long pause before the goblin spoke again. The contract was written up in 1821 AD. It appears that the specific parameters of the arrangement have not been met until now. Or your niece would not have received the letter. Had you been 10 years younger, it might have been you that had to fulfill the arrangement. Bloodnail smiled as he slid the ledger to Amelia. The head of the magical law enforcement read over the papers, her keen eyes looking for any clause or wording that could release Susan from this travesty. However, the more she read, the bleaker the outlook was. The contract was quite solid. Susan would have to go through with it, or the consequences would be quite dire, and not only for the young redhead, but the entire Bones line. There's no way to break it? Amelia asked. already knowing the answer. No. Bloodnail said flatly. Your niece must be wed in by her 19th birthday, or the Bones family line will suffer under the terms outlined. My sincerest apologies, and congratulations. Amelia glared at the goblin, who chuckled softly. Do you know who the boy is, and if he's been informed? Amelia asked, looking hard into the coal-black eyes of the goblin. I am not the account manager for that family. Even if I were, I could not give you that information. You shall have to discover that information on your own, I'm afraid. But, if he is 16, then I am sure he has been notified. We are very thorough here. I know. May I get a copy of this to take home to review further? Amelia asked. That is your copy. Bloodnail said, pointing to the ledger. Is there anything else I may help you with? No. That will be all. Amelia said irritably. She'd always hated dealing with the goblins. She could not deny they were brilliant creatures, and that the wizarding world was better off with them handling the finances. But they were diabolical, devious little bastards, and their egos knew no bounds. Very well. Next time, do try to make an appointment. I may not be coming back from lunch, and as you know, we goblins do not take kindly to threats, Madam Bones. Amelia said nothing, but left the office with the ledger. Her next stop was the Hall of Records in the Ministry. She needed to find out who the boy was her niece was being forced to marry. And then she had to figure out the softest way to break it to her niece that she was truly and utterly betrothed. Susan didn't deserve this. She had already suffered great disappointments and loss in her young life. Her parents had been killed when she was still a baby. It was on the very same night that Amelia had lost her husband. He who must not be named had done it himself. As a warning to Amelia, who was a top orer at the time. Amelia hadn't had time to grieve, and pushed all her heartache out of her heart as she took Susan in. It had been the very best thing, as Susan had given her 10 lifetimes of joy. She had become a smart, well-mannered, beautiful young woman, if not a little boy crazy. Amelia saw so much of her brother in Susan. Funny, caring, and fiercely loyal. More reasons Amelia hated whomever had done this to her niece. Susan should have been allowed to opportunity to find her own happiness. Amelia ignored everyone who tried to talk to her as she entered the ministry. She was a woman on a mission. She made straight for the Hall of Records. Without so much as a hello to the tiny man behind the desk, Amelia began searching for her answers. It took 2 hours, and some help from the tiny man who worked there to find out exactly who it was that was now contractually obligated to be Susan's husband. When she found the answer, Amelia felt as if someone had just hit her in the chest and knocked all the air from her lungs. Amelia triple-checked all her work to make sure she had the right person. Surely she had to be wrong. While Amelia didn't know the boy, she did know his name, and a bit of his reputation. She had met the boy once, but had not spoken to him. And given the circumstances of their meeting hadn't been ideal. Amelia stared at the name, repeating it over and over in her mind, picturing the boy she had seen. Amelia actually had to smile as she thought of her niece and that particular boy together. Amelia arrived home an hour later, and could hear that Hannah had indeed arrived. It was 2 hours before Susan's party was to start. The girls were outside, singing along to the wireless. Susan sounded much cheerier than she had when Amelia had left. Guests would be arriving for the party very soon, and Amelia thought for a moment about waiting to tell her niece what she had discovered, but she knew that as soon as Susan saw her, she'd want answers, and she would be unable to enjoy her party until she had them. Though, Amelia was sure that once Susan got the truth, she would likely not want a party anyway. Susan, would you come in here please? You too, Hannah. Amelia figured she may as well include the young blonde in the conversation. Susan was going to need all the support she could get, and Hannah would find out eventually. Susan hated keeping secrets from her best friend. Amelia had instilled a strong sense of honesty in her niece early on. "What did you find out?" Susan asked, barely inside the house. With Hannah close behind. "You need to sit down. You weren't able to get me out of it?" "It's real," Susan asked, her voice rising in pitch, and her tone becoming more panicked. "Please sit down." Amelia tried again, but Susan was not going to stop. "When did it happen? How come I'm only finding out about it all now?" "Susan, please sit down." Susan and a clearly confused Hannah both took seats on the sofa as Amelia removed the ledger from her traveling cloak along with the bit of parchment that held the name of Susan's intended. "The contract is real, and no, I was not able to get you out of it. It was put together in 1821 between Malcolm Bones and Edmund Peveril to end a feud and unite our two families. The arrangement was very specific, and the parameters of that arrangement were not met until now. It could have been me, or even your father if circumstances had been different. It could have even been your child if you had not met the criteria. The fact of the matter is..." "Please don't say it." Susan started to well up again, and Amelia's heart began to break. "Say what?" Hannah asked, very confused. "What's going on?" "That you are now." "No." Susan shouted, tears falling freely now, her head shaking frantically. "Engaged to be married," Amelia said with a sad sigh. Susan broke down, and Amelia gathered her niece into her arms trying to comfort her. "What?" was all Hannah could say. "A betrothal contract was written between House Bones and House Peveril years ago. But due to the extreme conditions of the contract, and life's own circumstances, it was never fulfilled. Susan now meets that criteria, as does the boy from that family. She has to be married by the time she turns 19. She also has to have a baby within 3 years of the ceremony, or suffer the consequences defined by the contract." "What consequences?" Susan bemoaned, her face blotchy and her eyes red from crying. "How bad are they?" "Pretty bad, and it isn't just you who will suffer. Our entire line, past and future, will suffer. And his family too. We're talking big time problems for you, me, and anyone with Bones blood in their family line. Maybe even losing your magic. I don't know any Peverils. Are they from another country or something?" Hannah asked. "I mean, there aren't any Peverils at Hogwarts that I know of. I had to do some digging, but it turns out the Peveril line died out in 1857. But the bloodline, and the contract passed on to a new family," Amelia explained. "Who?" Susan sobbed. "Who am I condemned to be with for the rest of my life?" Amelia hated that Susan felt it was equal to some kind of prison, not that she could blame the girl. She released Susan from her embrace and picked up the folded piece of parchment and handed it to her niece. "This is why I wanted you to sit down," Amelia said as Susan unfolded the letter. Hannah was on her feet and peering over her best friend's shoulder at the name scribbled on the scrap of parchment. Hannah's eyes bulged to impossible sizes and she clutched the back of the chair to hold herself steady. Susan's sobs stopped, as did her breathing. All the color drained from her face, and a second later, she was falling out of her seat. Amelia caught her before she smacked her head on the floor. "Oh. Wow," Hannah whispered, lowering herself carefully to the floor to prevent herself from falling over. "Hannah, this is very important. No one can know about this for now, for both of their sakes, all right?" Amelia said sternly. Hannah nodded. "No one would believe it?" Hannah said, her voice barely a whisper. Susan was moaning slightly as Amelia fanned her face. The color was slowly coming back to her face, and Amelia breathed a soft sigh of relief. Not that she could blame her niece, this was a lot to take in. Neither of them need the attention this will bring. Amelia pointed out. Especially him. She is so lucky. I'm sure that's exactly what she's feeling. Amelia said with a wry smile. Well, no. Hannah corrected, finally feeling the spinning sensation go away. I mean, being stuck in a marriage contract sucks, I'm sure, and I know she hates that, but of all the guys in the world she could have ended up with. I mean, wow. Harry Potter. It was one of the hardest things Susan had ever had to do. To get all dressed up and pretend that she was excited and happy when inside she was just miserable. Susan wanted nothing more than to run away from her birthday party, scream about the injustice of the universe and how wrong it was that she was being forced to marry someone she had no feelings for. Yet, she put on her new undergarments that Hannah had given her. A short black skirt and her favorite button-up blouse along with some heeled sandals, and greeted every one of her guests with her most charming smile. No one who met Susan that evening would have guessed that her world had just been turned on its head. She came very close to losing it when Zach arrived with his girlfriend, who looked very pretty that day. Susan felt the sting of tears in her eyes, but she managed to cover it well with the excuse of allergies. Susan mingled with her friends, talking idly about how the summer was going so far. Hannah was at her side for support. At least until Neville Longbottom arrived. Susan felt a pang of jealousy at her best friend. Though Susan didn't fancy Neville, Hannah got to choose who she liked, and be with that person. If Susan had been honest with herself, she really was of two minds about the entire situation. On the one hand, it was very unfair that she had just had the experience of falling in love taken away from her. She would not be able to meet someone, get to know them, begin to have inexplicable feelings, and then having that wondrous revelation that she was in love. She would not be taken out on dates, or wooed, or any of that. She wouldn't even get a proper proposal with the guy on his knee with an amazing ring for her to wear. However, Harry Potter was easily one of the most desirable wizards in all of Britain. Each year, he just got better looking. It was something of a start-of-year ritual with her and the other Hufflepuff girls to theorize about which boys had gotten better looking, and then see who was right. They always saved Harry for last. And Harry never seemed to disappoint them. Maybe it was the constant swirl of rumors surrounding him, or the way he just seemed to ooze charisma. Something about Harry Potter made him undeniably fanciable. Susan knew virtually nothing about him, save for the rumors, but she had seen firsthand how sweet he could be. He was very helpful during the lessons, and Susan remembered one time he had taken hold of her arm to show her where she was going wrong with one of her spells. Susan remembered being short of breath for some reason. But having your breath taken away did not a romance make. Susan tried to shove all those thoughts out of her mind. Her aunt had promised they would discuss it at length when the party was all over. The problem was that Susan didn't want to wait, and as it turned out, there was someone at her party that may be able to answer some questions. And that person was currently by themselves at the snack table. "Are you having a good time?" Susan asked, coming up behind the lone girl, who was contemplating a bowl of crisps and the vegetable platter. "Oh, yes. Thank you, and happy birthday again." The girl smiled very sweetly. Susan cringed inwardly. Right now she wanted to rip the other girl's hair out. Why Zach had chosen this girl over her was such a mystery. But Susan suppressed her anger. She had something to accomplish here. "I thought it would be imposing for me to come along, but Zach insisted that it would be all right with you," the girl said, clearly worried. "He was right. I don't mind. But you didn't have to bring me a present. It wasn't any trouble." Usually I just get people books as gifts, but that didn't seem proper for a girl turning 16. The girl laughed. Susan did as well. I bet Harry and Ron just love getting your gifts then. Susan grinned. Hermione Granger laughed again, and shook her head. I've been getting a lot better about buying them gifts. I can usually just get Ron a load of sweets from Honeydukes. Harry's a little harder to shop for, but in the end it doesn't matter because he's just so great. Hermione trailed off, her cheeks pinkening a bit. Susan knew that the girl had nearly let something slip, but she wasn't sure quite what to make of it. Well, I do like your gift. And I can't wait for the right time to wear it. Susan hadn't been lying. The necklace was very pretty, with its silver pendant. It made hating Hermione that much harder. Susan knew she was going to have to get over her jealousy. Zack was off the table, in fact, all other boys were off the table for her. Stupid ancestors. She snarled internally. Do you think Harry will continue this year? Susan asked. She had to be really careful. Hermione was incredibly smart and exceptionally perceptive. Susan didn't want to give anything away, but she needed to learn a little about her future husband if she could. I'm not really sure. Hermione shrugged. He never mentioned it on the train, but... Again Hermione trailed off, looking a bit embarrassed. You've done that twice now. Susan said. And Hermione nodded. It's just that Harry's a pretty private person. And I don't want to betray his trust by talking about him. You mean about what really happened at the ministry last month? Susan asked. Hermione gave a sad little nod. Don't believe the paper, they got it all wrong. Hermione started to say, but once again faded off. Susan realized at once how protective Hermione was of her best friend. She then began thinking she wasn't going to get much out of the bushy-haired girl. But she still had to try. I heard a bit about it from my auntie. Susan lowered her voice to near whisper. I know that you and Neville and the others went there and that you're fought Death Eaters. But I don't know why. And I can't tell you. Hermione said quickly. To protect Harry. Susan queried and Hermione nodded. There you are. Zachariah Smith said as he pulled Hermione into a hug and kissed her cheek. I was wondering where you went. You said you were getting a drink. Susan and I started talking. Hermione said with a smile. Until you interrupted. Susan smirked. Zach smiled and apologized for disturbing them. It was clear to Susan that he wanted her to get along with his girlfriend. As obnoxious as Zach could be, he was still very considerate, and sweet. He grabbed a handful of crisps and kissed Hermione before going back to the group of boys he'd been chatting with earlier. He really is a good guy. Susan said with a sigh. You like him? Don't you? Hermione said, looking rather guilty. Yeah. I was hoping he would ask me out last year. Then you two started dating, and... I'm really sorry. Hermione said, looking close to tears now. I knew I shouldn't have come, but he just kept telling me that it would be okay and... Hermione, it is okay. Really? Susan said quickly, taking Hermione's arm. He's happy with you, and that's what really matters. Besides, I kind of have someone else in my life now. Susan said cryptically. Hermione looked at her curiously for a minute but Susan didn't say any more. Well, I hope he treats you right. You're a very nice person, Susan, and I hope that maybe we could become friends. I'd like that. Susan said honestly. She knew that if she was going to become Harry's wife, that Hermione would likely be part of her life too. Harry didn't seem the type to abandon his friends. I'm so sorry. But I need to steal the birthday girl for a moment. Hannah said as she grabbed Susan and guided her away. Rude. Susan snapped as Hannah guided her into a private corner. I know, I'm sorry. But I just couldn't wait for you to finish your interrogation of Granger. Hannah said. Did you find out anything about Harry? How did you know? Please. Why else would you be talking to the girl who stole your would-be boyfriend other than to try and grill her for info on your future husband? Oh, please don't use that word right now. Susan grimaced, wrapping her arms around herself to ward off a chill. What did you want that you had to drag me away? Maybe I should have waited. Hannah said guiltily. I just forgot about everything, and I wanted to. Look, it can wait. No, go ahead. Susan sighed. At least one of us should be happy. Now I feel really stupid. Hannah sighed. I'm sorry. Hannah. What happened? Susan pressed. Hannah tried to smile, though it was clear that she was now feeling very guilty for whatever she was about to tell her best friend. Susan guessed it had something to do with Neville, and wasn't disappointed when Hannah finally spilled the beans. He asked me out. I don't know what happened to him, but he's just so much more confident. He just took me aside and said that he's liked me for a while, and he promised himself that he would ask me the very next time he saw me. After I said yes, he kissed me, and I got to tell you, he's a really amazing kisser. Susan smiled. She really was happy for Hannah, but it just made her own predicament seem more grim. The rest of the party was a blur to Susan. By the time the last guest left through the flue, Susan felt exhausted. It was a lot of effort to act as if the world was perfect. Slumping into a chair, Susan undid her shoes and began rubbing her feet to ease some of the ache. Hannah sat across from her looking a little dazed. She had said a very thorough goodbye to Neville. Susan had seen what Hannah had meant when she had said he seemed more confident. Neville didn't blush at all when he'd kissed Hannah goodbye. He also didn't seem fazed by Ernie and Justin's ribbing. He just smiled and waved as he stepped through the flue. Here you go. Amelia said, handing a steaming mug of tea to Susan before sitting on the sofa. You did well tonight. I know it must have been hard, but this is a delicate situation. I did notice you talking to Hermione Granger. Did you happen to learn anything? Susan looked a bit self-conscious. Not really. Hermione's very loyal to Harry, and she wouldn't say anything about him. That's a good sign. Amelia said. It means she can be trusted. From what I've gathered, she likely his most loyal friend, along with Neville, though Harry and Neville are not very close. Neville really looks up to Harry, Hannah piped in. He's got a lot of respect for him too. That's why he went to the ministry with Harry. He told me so. Amelia nodded. All of those kids respect Harry and look up to him, or they wouldn't have gone with him. I talked to each of them in the days after. Good kids, all of them. Why they felt the need to. Well, never mind. Auntie, what happened at the ministry? Why were they there at all? Susan asked. You know I can't tell you anything about that. Amelia said, then her expression softened and she gave Susan a wink. Maybe if you ask nicely, Harry will tell you. Susan glared at her aunt for a few seconds and then shook her head. This is going to be really hard. The redhead said after a long silence. He keeps to himself a lot, and he's always with Granger and Weasley. How am I supposed to get to know him? So far as I know, Harry doesn't yet know about the contract. He won't know until his 16th birthday, and I don't know exactly when that is. Amelia frowned. I am planning on finding out who his magical guardian is, and discussing the possibility of telling him sooner. Maybe he could stay here. Hannah suggested. Both Susan and Amelia turned questioning eyes to the blonde, who turned quite red. "Well, I just thought it would give Susan and Harry a chance to get to know each other without loads of people around, spreading stories and all that. No matter what you decide to do, it's going to be really awkward for both of you. Maybe we could consider something like that," Amelia said. "But it's very late, and we all need to get a bit of sleep. Tomorrow I'll leave you some money so you can go shopping, but you are by no means to go into Diagon Alley, is that clear?" Both girls nodded, and Amelia ushered them off to bed, and then went to her own bedroom, where she lay awake thinking on what Hannah had suggested. Amelia's only worry would be leaving two teenagers alone with no supervision. Amelia wasn't so old that she couldn't remember what it was like to be 16, and what she would have done if she was left alone with a boy. Susan was quite practical, and Amelia doubted that her niece would allow anything to happen that she wasn't comfortable with. But it was Amelia's job to worry. Having Harry stay with them would give Susan and Harry a chance to get to know one another without too much pressure being put on them, and Amelia would also have a chance to get to know the boy. That was a good reason in itself. Maybe she would make a decision after she got a chance to speak with the boy. First she had to find out who the boy's guardian was. Then maybe she would have a clearer idea of how best to proceed. It took seconds before Hannah's breathing leveled out and she fell asleep. Susan was incredibly jealous of her best friend at the moment. It would be nice to be that carefree and to be able to fall asleep and dream about snogging her new boyfriend. Susan wished that she had been able to talk to Hermione for a bit longer during the party. She couldn't think of anybody who was more of an authority on Harry Potter. Okay, Ron Weasley knew Harry pretty well, but Ron was very difficult to talk to, as he was quick to anger, and very protective of his friends. Likely Ron would get suspicious or misunderstand something and then get angry and defensive. Hermione, on the other hand, while being protective of Harry, was more willing to listen. Susan didn't want to go telling Hermione that she was engaged to Harry, but she could have made it seem like she was interested in Harry as a potential boyfriend, and maybe learned a bit about him. Like the best way to talk to him. Harry just seemed so unapproachable. It wasn't that he was mean or anything, just that he seemed so guarded. Susan did think that she was lucky in all of this. Being betrothed to Harry Potter wasn't the worst thing that could have happened to her. It could have been someone like Goyle or Crabbe from Slytherin House. Susan shivered as she imagined one of those baboons pawing at her. She began to wonder what it might be like to kiss Harry. So far as she knew, Harry hadn't had a girlfriend, save for Cho Chang, and the rumor was that had ended very badly. Of course anyone with eyes could have seen that Harry and Cho were a bad match. Especially since Cho was still hung up on Cedric Diggory. It was unfair to both of them. Susan knew that Ginny Weasley had a major league crush on Harry, but she hadn't acted on it. In fact, Ginny was supposed to be dating Dean Thomas. So, Harry was in fact single at the moment, or at least Susan thought he was. But this just went back to how unapproachable he seemed. Susan knew that a lot of girls liked Harry, but none of them seemed brave enough to try and even talk to him. Susan had no idea how she might talk to the boy, and they were engaged. To Susan's mind, that only made the situation far more complex. Yet, Susan was sure that if she could figure a way past Harry's walls, they could very likely become friends, and that was something. It somehow eased the thought of marriage. Sure, they may not be in love, but at least they wouldn't hate each other. That would just make things really tough. Susan suddenly shot bolt upright in her bed when a thought occurred to her. Did Auntie say we had to have a baby? It was a shock to Amelia when she learned who Harry Potter's legal magical guardian was. As Sirius Black had been killed only a few weeks earlier, there was no possible way for Amelia to talk with him about Susan and Harry's predicament. But Amelia was nothing if not tenacious. She spent most of her morning trying to think of anyone who might be able to set up a meeting with the boy. Someone the boy trusted, and who help ease the boy's concerns over the situation. And then, as if she'd been hit by a swollen hippogriff, the answer came to her. However, before she could act upon it, she was called to a meeting with the Minister of Magic. Amelia felt it was a waste of time. Fudge was flailing, to put it mildly. After a year of his smear campaign against Potter and Dumbledore, only to have them proven right was too much for the public to take. There was to be an emergency session of the Wizengamot where Fudge's leadership was to be called into question. Amelia was going to be there, and she already had her mind made up. She also knew that Fudge was meeting with every person on the Wizengamot, hoping to sway their opinion. So far as she knew, it wasn't working. Amelia sent a note to Fudge, apologizing for being unable to see him, but that she had a family emergency that needed to be taken care of at once. After sending off the letter, Amelia went to her fireplace, gathered a fistful of flue powder, and called out her destination. She gracefully stepped out of the green flames into the circular office of Albus Dumbledore, who rose politely from his seat. "Forgive me, Madam Bones, but I was unaware that we had a meeting." Dumbledore smiled politely. "Actually, I'm the one who needs to apologize. First, I should have asked to see you before just showing up unannounced. You may have been busy, but this is a rather urgent matter," Amelia said. Dumbledore nodded and motioned for the head of the DMLE a chair, which she took gratefully. "Something's happened, and I'm afraid it involves Harry Potter." Dumbledore's smile faltered a bit, his twinkling blue eyes glancing to the spindle-legged table with all his whirring and smoking silver instruments. Amelia noticed, but chose not to remark. Instead, she launched into her explanation. "My niece Susan received an official letter upon her 16th birthday yesterday. I was quite confused by it, but I went to see our account manager at Gringotts and we went over everything. There is a betrothal contract between House Bones and House Peveril, now known as Potter, and it's unbreakable." Dumbledore now looked as if he'd just been slapped. He looked as if he were about to speak several times, but nothing came out. And then, to Amelia's great surprise, he began laughing. "This is indeed quite the predicament," he chuckled. "That's an understatement," Amelia replied, not seeing the humor. "It is at that, but I do not think it is at all bad. In fact, this may be the answer I've been searching for." "Excuse me?" Amelia asked, no thoroughly confused. "I'm afraid it would take a great deal of time to explain," Dumbledore said, trying to wave off Amelia's questioning look, but the head of the DMLE was not going to be brushed off like that. "I'd say you'd better start explaining yourself," Amelia huffed. Her stern gaze was enough to make Dumbledore start chuckling, though the mirth never left his eyes. He took a few calming breaths and began explaining why he believed that Harry and Susan under a betrothal contract was not necessarily a bad thing. "How much do you know of what happened at the end of the Triwizard Tournament?" he asked. Amelia looked puzzled, but thought of the question for a moment. "I'm afraid I don't know much. The investigation was forcibly shut down before it really got started," Amelia grimaced. "I was afraid of that," Dumbledore said with a bitter scowl. "But you are at least aware of the story?" "Yes. Potter and Diggory were allegedly transported by Portkaya to a graveyard where you know who used Harry for some ritual and killed Diggory." "Very close," Dumbledore said. "Lord Voldemort used a very ancient and dark ritual to construct a body for himself using a bone from his father, flesh from a servant and blood from an enemy. For this, he chose Harry for two reasons. Harry is his most feared enemy, but Harry's blood contains a magical protection bestowed upon him by his mother when she sacrificed herself to save Harry. It is Harry's blood that will help defeat Lord Voldemort, I believe. I'm a little lost. How do you think that's going to happen? Amelia asked. With love. Dumbledore smiled. The sacrifice Harry's mother made invoked a very old magic. One that bestowed powerful protection on her son. While living Harry lives with his relatives, there is a blood ward erected that will keep those who wish Harry harm away. But more than that, by taking Harry's blood, Lord Voldemort has corrupted himself. The more that Harry feels love, and loves in return, the magic will grow in strength. It is my belief, especially after what I witnessed in the ministry this past month, that if Harry were to be in love with someone, that magic would gain in strength and begin to decay Lord Voldemort from within. If Harry and young Susan could find love with each other, it could help us defeat Lord Voldemort once and for all. What makes you think it would actually work? Amelia asked at last. There is no precedent for this situation, and nearly everything I told you is nothing more than guesswork and hypothesis. But I am confident that I am correct. Everything seems to point to this one singular answer. No matter what, Lord Voldemort is set on killing Harry. The final battle will be between Harry and Lord Voldemort. Any advantage Harry can get will be best for all of us. That's asking a lot of two teenagers who haven't even spoken to one another. You know there is no guarantee. They could literally hate each other. I find that unlikely at best. Dumbledore smiled. Susan, from what I have observed, is a very kind, generous, and open-minded young woman. Harry is selfless, loyal, and honest. Yes, there is the possibility that they will not fall in love, but, I am sure that they can become close friends at the worst. However, Harry already has several friends that he cares deeply for. But in order for these magics to work, it must be the truest of loves. What if we explained all this to the both of them? That would be ill-advised. You can't force two people to find love, they have to find it on their own. As I explained, it must be pure, and it must come naturally. What I propose is that we get them together and allow them time outside of school to get acquainted without the pressures being in school will put on them. You mean set them up on a date? Amelia couldn't help the smile that came when she spoke. The idea seemed ludicrous at this point. I was thinking something a bit longer. Are you aware that Harry wishes to become an Auror? Amelia had already been considering what she knew Dumbledore was suggesting. She listened to the headmaster's reasoning. An hour later Amelia had come to a decision. However, given all she had learned, she knew that it was the best thing to do in this situation. In truth, if she hadn't thought it was a good idea, she never would have agreed, no matter how much Dumbledore tried to pull her strings. Besides, it meant she would get a chance to speak to the boy herself. When you are ready, Dumbledore said as the phoenix took flight from its perch and alighted upon Dumbledore's outstretched arm. Amelia went to the headmaster's side and it took his hand. In a flash of bright fire, the two disappeared. Vernon Dursley was beyond annoyed. He had planned to sit himself in front of the telly to watch the football game. He'd made himself a rather massive sandwich, and filled a punch bowl full of crisps which he'd sat next to his favorite chair. Petunia was busy with cleaning her kitchen, and Dudley was out with his friends, and the freak was upstairs, respectfully quiet for once. It was starting to be the perfect evening, and then some ignorant, disrespectful salesperson had to go ruin it all by coming to call. Well, Vernon was going to give this unfortunate soul a good piece of his mind for bothering hard-working decent folks on the day off. Sucking in a great gulp of air to ready himself, Vernon opened the door, and his mind went blank, and the only sound he could manage was a small pathetic squeak. "Good evening, Mr. Dursley," said the tall thin man with half-moon spectacles and the obscenely long silver beard. The man was wearing flowing purple robes with bright silver stars sewn in. He was standing with a woman with dark graying hair, sharp eyes, and a stern expression and black robes. "I am Albus Dumbledore, the headmaster of young Harry's school. May we please come in? We have something to discuss with you." The man then entered the Dursley home without an actual invitation, followed by the stern-looking woman, who immediately began looking over everything with her sharp hawk-like eyes. "Vernon, who's at the eep?" Petunia Dursley stammered as she entered into the hallway from the kitchen. She stopped cold when she saw the two strangely attired people in her house. "Ah, Petunia, it's very good to finally meet you in person. We have corresponded through the years, but it is so nice to see you in person at last." The man with the silver beard smiled, offering a friendly hand, which made Petunia back away with fright. "Very well, perhaps this might be more comfortable if we all took a seat, but first, if you would be so kind as to ask Harry to join us, as this is about him." Dumbledore smiled. Vernon suddenly regained his senses, and peered out the open door, making sure none of the neighbors was watching before closing it quickly and turning on these intruders. Once again, his tirade died in his throat when he found the woman watching him with a calculating expression. "He's not here," Petunia said firmly, or what she must have thought was firm. Her voice quivered badly. "Perhaps if you'd thought to call ahead of time like decent people, we might have been able to keep him nearby. I am afraid the situation did not allow for advanced notice." The man spoke evenly. "As my wife has said, the boy is not here. Now I'll ask you to kindly leave before I call the authorities," Vernon said in a huff, his anger beginning to win over his fear. "I'll have you know that I am the authorities," the woman said sharply as she turned to peer at Vernon, making the obese man cower under her stern gaze. "We also know that you are lying. Now, please fetch Harry." "Professor Dumbledore." Everyone turned to find a tall skinny boy with messy raven black hair and sad emerald green eyes watching them from the staircase. Amelia frowned at Dumbledore, who seemed to be losing that mirthful twinkle in his eye as he gazed on Harry Potter. Amelia then took in the boy's appearance more carefully. He was far too thin for a boy of his height and age. He had dark circles under his eyes which signaled that he'd not had a proper night's sleep in a while. His clothes were in a horrendous state. They looked 3 to 4 sizes too big for him, and also looked to be that of a child's, not a teenage boy. "Would you be so kind as to join us, Harry? We have a few very important things in which to discuss," Dumbledore asked kindly. Harry nodded and came the rest of the way down the stairs. Amelia noted the way Harry hurriedly got around his uncle, as if he were trying to keep his distance. Dumbledore followed Harry and Amelia motioned for Harry's aunt and uncle to enter the sitting room as well before following and taking a seat upon the sofa. "Harry, I had intended to come see you in a few days and take you to the Weasleys for the remainder of the summer, but events had occurred which facilitate an earlier departure." "I'm leaving?" Harry asked, and Amelia noted the hopefulness in his voice. "Yes." Dumbledore smiled. "But before that happens, we need to speak to you on a few rather important subjects. Firstly, Sinus will reading was yesterday. I am sorry that you could not attend, but for safety reasons." "I understand," Harry said dejectedly, his eyes darkening. "Sirius has left everything to you. You gain a substantial amount of gold. You also inherit all of Sirius' personal possessions, as well as 3 houses, including number 12 Grimmauld Place. You can keep using it for the Order," Harry said bitterly. "I don't want it." "That is very kind of you." Dumbledore smiled. "But as of now, we have had to vacate the premises. We are unsure if you are even the rightful owner at this time." "His godfather's dead?" Vernon asked, a greedy spark in his beady little eyes. Everyone turned to stare at Vernon, who coughed, tried to clear his throat, and then tried to sound more sympathetic. "He's dead." "Sadly, yes," Dumbledore said with a small nod, and narrowed eyes. He turned back to Harry and gave a grandfatherly smile. "As I was saying, we are unsure if you will even be able to take ownership. You see, pure-blood family tradition decrees that property is handed down through the generations to the next male in the family line, unless of course no male existed. As Sirius was the very last Black, the houses should be passed to the next male on the family tree. Many times enchantments were placed to prevent any from the rightful heir to take possession. In this case, the next person in line to take possession would be Bellatrix Lestrange." "No," Harry said vehemently. "Our thoughts exactly." Dumbledore nodded. "Our situation is quite complicated. However, we do have a very simple test in which we can find out if you are the proper owner of the Black properties. You see, if you have indeed inherited the properties, you will have also inherited Creaker." "No," Harry said, his shoulders sagging. "I am aware of your feeling about Creaker, however, I think you may find him useful," Dumbledore said. "How do we find out if he belongs to me?" "You only have to call for him," Madame Bones said, looking quite interested. "Exactly." Dumbledore nodded. Harry took a deep breath and then, clearly and loudly said Creaker. There was a silence. Harry began looking about, as did his uncle and aunt. The silence stretched out. Dumbledore sighed heavily. "Well then. I suppose that means—" Crack. There before them was a wretched-looking beast that fell to its thin knobbly knees and began pounding its tiny fists onto the carpet, shrieking with distress. "It seems I nearly spoke too soon." Dumbledore smiled. "But it is clear now that you are the rightful owner of all the Black properties. If I may make a suggestion, you should have Creaker go to work at Hogwarts in the kitchens. There he will be unable to get into trouble with all the other elves to watch him. But you must order him to do so. Creaker, I want you to go to Hogwarts and work in the kitchens," Harry said, sounding a bit relieved. Creaker got to his feet and scowled angrily at Harry. He looked murderous, but Harry was unfazed. He knew enough about house elves to know that Creaker would be unable to do anything to him. With another loud crack, Creaker disappeared. "Now that we have that solved, there is another house elf that has been rather insistent that I ask you if you would consent to employ him. He says he is quite happy in his current position, but it is his fondest wish to be bound to your family. It's Dobby, isn't it, sir?" Harry smiled in spite of himself. "It is indeed. And if I may offer a bit of advice, I think it would be wise of you to employ him, and place him as your head elf. He would then be able to keep his eyes on Creaker and make sure that Creaker stays in line. That would simply be one useful thing Dobby would be able to do for you." Harry seemed to think it over for a moment before nodding. "I'll talk to him," Harry promised. "Good." Dumbledore smiled. "That just leaves one final item. Harry, this is Amelia Bones, she is the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement." "You were at my trial," Harry said. "I was. Very good memory." Madame Bones smiled. "It'll be a day that sticks with me the rest of my life," Harry admitted. "I can imagine. What can I do for you?" Harry asked. "Mr. Potter. Harry, yesterday was my niece's 16th birthday. It was supposed to be a very special day. As it turned out, it became an incredibly special day. You see, yesterday Susan became engaged to be married." Harry looked to Dumbledore and then back to Amelia, clearly confused why this woman was telling him that Susan Bones was now engaged to be married. You see, there is a marriage contract that has existed between House Bones and House Peveril for nearly 100 years or so. Unfortunately, the specific parameters of the contract have never been fulfilled in order to activate it. That changed, and the contract is now in effect. Harry simply stared at Amelia, waiting for her to continue. Amelia took a deep breath, continued. Harry, the Peveril line died out over 100 years ago. When that happened, the contract passed on to the next family connected to that line. The Potter family line. Harry simply sat there silently as Amelia's words began to settle in his brain. When realization of what Amelia was saying hit him, Harry stood up straight and gaped. Me! He shouted. Him! Vernon Dursley shouted, pointing at his nephew. He's not old enough to be married. Petunia shouted. We all should calm down, Dumbledore said, looking imploringly at Harry, who was still standing up, though he looked very wobbly on his feet. Is there a way out of it? Harry pleaded, now turning to Dumbledore. I'm afraid not, Amelia stated. The contract is quite firm, but it allows you a couple of years before it needs to be fulfilled. It gives you the chance to get to know each other. I know this is upsetting to you, Harry, but this may not be such a bad thing. Dumbledore tried. Are you mental? Harry shouted, backing up. How is being forced to marry someone I barely know, much less have no feelings for one way or another, a good thing? For either of us? What about what we want? What about who we might want to be with? Harry turned his back on them, going to the fireplace and taking a few moments to calm himself. Does she know? Does she know about what I have to do? Does she even know that just by talking to me she could wind up dead? Harry asked, his voice low and filled with pain. Miss Bones is as of yet unaware of the full situation, but I have explained things to Madame Bones. It's part of the reason I wish to extend an invitation for you to come stay with me for the rest of the summer, Amelia said. Harry turned around again, looking perplexed. What? The headmaster did explain some things to me this afternoon, and I have come to the decision that it would be in yours and Susan's best interests if you were to stay with us for the summer. It would allow you both time to get to know one another before school without pressure. Also, I think you will find that staying with the head of magical law enforcement comes with certain advantages for someone in your unique situation. For instance, there is an expansive library on defensive magic that you would have access to, not to mention that I could secure a permit for the use of underage magic for the summer. Harry looked suddenly as if he had been given an early birthday present. He gave a small smile and Amelia returned the gesture. What about the wards? He asked suddenly, looking to Dumbledore, who frowned deeply as he gazed disapprovingly at Harry's aunt and uncle. I fear that even if you were to remain here for 10 years, the wards would not strengthen. As it is, they are barely standing. When they fall, I have no doubt that Voldemort and his minions will descend on this house and burn it to the ground and kill all who reside within. What are you saying? Vernon snapped. Are you threatening us? No, Mr. Dursley. Dumbledore sighed. I am telling you that by your treatment of Harry all these years, you have inadvertently placed yourself in danger. I assume you are aware that our world is under threat of war by the terrorist who calls himself Voldemort. He's going to come after us. Petunia looked panicked. It is likely. He cares not about your feelings towards Harry. While I am sure that he would find you both willing allies in your hatred of Harry, he will kill you solely based on the fact that you harbored Harry all these years. And because you were not of magical blood, Dumbledore stated before turning to Petunia. I admit myself curious. Was it your petty jealousy of Lily's abilities or fear of her forgetting you altogether that made you such a bitter and spiteful person who would treat a child so poorly? The child of your only sister, no less. You can't speak to my wife that way," Vernon roared. "And I have had enough of this rubbish. If you're going to take him, then take him and good riddance. I've put up with this nonsense for far too long, and I wish it to be at an end at long less. Go. All of you, go. Get out of my house at once and never bother us again." "Very well," Dumbledore said as he rose to his feet. "Harry, I suggest that you go and collect your things. We shall be on our way as soon as you are ready." Harry tore up the stairs and gathered his things. As he'd only been back at the Dursleys for 2 weeks, there wasn't much he had to pack. He was so intent on gathering every last bit of his belongings that he barely thought about anything else. And then, as he closed his trunk, and slipped on a jacket, it struck him that he was for all intents and purposes, engaged to be married. He wasn't sure exactly how he was supposed to feel. He of course knew who Susan Bones was. He had even spoken to her once or twice during the last year. Outside of that, he knew next to nothing about the girl. Harry had no idea how he was to be expected to marry a girl that he didn't know. Then Harry began to wonder what could happen if he chose not to go through with it. He knew that magical contract could extract a heavy toll on those who tried to ignore them, or get out of their commitments. But what exactly were the consequences of not fulfilling a marriage contract? Deciding he would ask when they were on their way, Harry took one last look around his bedroom, wondering if he would be forced to return there ever again. Harry came down the stairs dragging his trunk while he struggled with Hedwig's cage. The snowy owl squeaked and hooted indignantly. "If you would allow me." Dumbledore smiled as he tapped his wand on Harry's trunk, shrinking it to the size of a matchbox. "Thank you, sir," Harry said gratefully as he shoved his micro-sized trunk into his pocket. "I am afraid that your aunt and uncle do not wish to see you off." Dumbledore sighed, looking into the sitting room where Harry knew his relatives must be cowering. "It's all right," Harry said flatly. "Harry, when we leave here, the wards will come down for good. You will not be returning to your aunt and uncle's home unless it is your choice to do so." "That is probably never going to happen," Harry muttered sourly. He then looked up to Dumbledore, the question on his lips. "For the rest of the summer, you shall be staying with Madame Bones. You will be able to visit with your friends and get to know Miss Bones better." Harry could only nod, as the magnitude of everything he'd learned that night was only beginning to set in. He was engaged to a young woman whom he barely knew. For some reason, he felt that Sirius was laughing at him somewhere. "Well then, we shall be off." Dumbledore smiled as he opened the front door. He stepped out into the early evening with Harry and Amelia Bones at his side. They walked down the little road for a few blocks before they came to the small walk that Harry usually used to get to the play park. Dumbledore stopped them, and then whistled softly. There was a flash, and Fawkes the Phoenix appeared, singing softly. Harry suddenly felt much calmer upon hearing the magical bird's song. "Fawkes will be taking us to Hogwarts. From there you will accompany Madame Bones to her home. Hold on to Fawkes' tail, please." It was far better than traveling by fluke, though not quite as nice as being on his own broom. Harry felt warmth that penetrated deep into his bones and eased his tired muscles. Tension he hadn't even realized he'd been feeling left him in the blink of an eye. He found himself standing in the headmaster's office at Hogwarts and he was suddenly filled with guilt. The last time he'd been in this room, he'd very nearly destroyed it. Sir Harry started, looking truly pathetic. I wanted to tell you that." Dumbledore waved off Harry's apology. "There is no need, Harry. All is as they say, water under the bridge. Are you ready, Harry? Amelia asked. Harry nodded, sparing one last glance to Dumbledore. Harry, if it should suit you, I would very much like to call on you later this summer. All right. Harry said, not sure why the headmaster wanted to see him. Harry's mind was so jumbled as it was, he decided to file it away for later examination. Dumbledore simply smiled and bade them well. Harry stepped into the flue with Madame Bones. An instant later, he was spilling onto the floor of the Bones sitting room floor. I really hate flue travel. Harry grumbled. It takes years to master. Amelia smiled, slipping off her cloak. I'll let you in on a secret. I end up on my butt quite a lot and I've been traveling by flue most of my life. Personally I prefer apparition, but sometimes it isn't the best way to go. So, I think we should get you situated. Follow me. Amelia led Harry up a set of stairs and down a hall. They passed by a room where Harry could hear music from a wireless, and two female voices. Hannah's spending some time here with us. During the day it'll be the three of you. Amy will make all your meals. A word of advice, stay out of the kitchen unless you want a nasty bruise. Amy is very protective of her kitchen. If you're hungry, just call for her, and she'll take care of it all. Amelia opened the door to a small bedroom, though it was double the size of Harry's room at the Dursleys. You have your own bathroom through there, and there's desk so you can do your summer homework and write letters. We have a swimming pool outside, that I'm sure you'll enjoy. Thank you. Harry said softly, gazing out the window, as he set Hedwig's cage on the desk, and opened it, allowing his faithful friend to come out. If you'll give me your trunk, I'll reverse Dumbledore's spell so you can unpack. Harry complied, and Amelia set the trunk on the floor before she cancelled the spell, allowing the trunk to revert to its normal size. Amelia watched as Harry slid his trunk to the foot of the double bed, and then sat down. Harry, may I ask you something personal? Harry looked up at the stern-looking woman and nodded tentatively. I noticed that your clothes are rather ill-fitting. Also, they aren't exactly what I would think a teenage boy would wear. That shirt looks like it should belong to a rather younger boy, what with the funny little duck on it. Harry's face reddened, and he looked away at once. He didn't say anything, which only served to answer the question for the head of magical law enforcement. I see. Amelia said softly. Harry, would you allow me to take you shopping for proper clothing tomorrow? Harry turned to look at the witch with a mix of embarrassment and intrigue. You don't have to do that. You don't need to spend any money on me. I don't want to be a burden. From what I understand, you should have no trouble affording quite a few new wardrobes. The Black family vault alone held quite a bit of money. I only wish to take you, and offer my opinion on clothing you choose. I think a stop in Diagon Alley for new robes, and then a day in London for something more becoming of a young wizard would be appropriate. Also, we could stop into the ministry and get you a permit to practice magic. We could make a day of it, and take the opportunity to get to know each other. That is, if you'd like. I would. Harry admitted honestly. Very good. Amelia smiled, clapping her hands. For tonight then, why don't you settle in? I'll have Amy bring you some food, and in the morning, we'll head out for an adventure. Harry nodded, and Amelia watched him for a moment longer before turning to go. Thank you, Madame Bones. Harry said softly. Amelia turned around and smiled again. When we're not in the ministry, I'd prefer it if you would call me Amelia. Harry smiled a little brighter and nodded. Amelia bid him good night and shut the door behind her. She stayed at the door for a moment, taking in everything she had seen and learned in regards to the famed boy who lived that night. He was not the attention-seeking egomaniac that some would have you believe. In fact, he seemed almost introverted. After taking a few calming breaths, she headed back down the hall, stopping at the room where the music was coming from. "Come in," Susan called from within. Amelia opened the door, and shut it behind her as she entered. Hannah got up from the bed she used while she visited and turned the radio down as Amelia sat next on Hannah's bed. "We have a guest with us as of tonight, and he will be with us until the end of summer." Susan's eyes immediately widened. "You didn't really bring him here, did you?" "Yes, Harry will be staying with us," Amelia said, answering the question that she knew Susan was getting ready to ask. "He is here for a few reasons, not the least of which is so that the two of you can spend time together. I'm going to ask you though not to bother him tonight. He's had kind of a rough night, due partly to me. Tomorrow I'll be taking him into London. When we get back, the four of us will have dinner together, and we'll see if we can't crack his shell a bit." "Is he okay?" Hannah asked, a bit of concern in her voice. "He's not at all what I expected," Amelia admitted. "I think there's a lot about his life outside of school he's kept hidden, and after what I saw and heard today." Amelia noticed that Susan's expression softened as her eyes went towards the door. Amelia's niece was quite the caring and selfless individual. It was likely that if she explained about Harry's situation, Susan would make a concerted effort to help Harry. Amelia didn't want that at all. As Dumbledore had said, it had to be natural and of their own free will. "You've both gotten quite a shock over the past 2 days. But at least now you're both on equal footing. Now it's up to you to make what you will of your situation," Amelia said. "I am going to head to bed. Try not to stay up too late." With that, Amelia kissed her niece on the forehead and left the two teen girls alone. "What do you think she was talking about?" Hannah asked. "I'm not sure," Susan admitted. "Do you know anything about Harry's life outside of Hogwarts?" "Only that he lives with his aunt and uncle, I think." "That's it?" Hannah shrugged, sitting back on her bed. "I think I heard that too," Susan agreed. "You don't think he was abused, do you?" "If he had been, someone would have done something, right?" Hannah asked. "Only if they knew about it," Susan said. "If no one checked on him, or he never said anything. And that would be just like him, wouldn't it?" Suffering in silence. "What do you mean?" Susan asked. "Did you see his left hand last year? Neville told me that Umbridge was making him use a blood quill. He's got scars that say I must not tell lies on his left hand. That's illegal." "I know, but he wouldn't say anything, and he made Ron and Hermione swear not to say anything. He also got mad at Neville when he noticed. He hid it most of the year. I never noticed it until Neville told me in after the day got broken up. I saw it during our transfiguration written tests." "How come you never said anything?" Susan balked. "I didn't know if it was true or not." "I mean, come on. You've heard all the same rumors I have. How can we know which ones are true or not?" Hannah said. Susan had to nod at this. "So, what should I do?" Susan sighed. "What do you mean?" Hannah looked perplexed. "How do I talk to him? I mean, no matter what, we're going to be married. I don't know how I'm supposed to interact with him. I don't have any feelings about him one way or another, and yet, I'm going to wind up married to him. It really messes with you head." "I'm sure of that." What I would suggest is to try and forget that part of it altogether for now. Look at it as a chance to be around one of the most desirable boys in the whole school. We got to see a little of what he's like during the day. He seemed pretty nice and he was always sweet to us. He was teaching us. I don't think he was all that interested in either of us romantically. Besides, he had a thing for Cho Chang, remember? Susan reminded her friend. Whatever. Look, don't try and rush anything. At this point, all you're doing is trying to be his friend. That's it. It's like your aunt said. You're spending time together, getting to know each other. No pressure. I will even try and make myself scarce for a few hours each day so you two can just be on your own. You don't have to do that, Susan said, but Hannah waved it off. Just promise to spare no details when you shag him rotten. Hannah smiled evilly. Oh gods, you're so wicked. Susan broke into giggles as Hannah caught the pillow her best friend hurled at her. Please like and subscribe.